everyone, my name is Ryan Cam, and welcome back to the 1999 Project, where I will try, in vain, to review every movie from the year 1999 as we close out the month of May, not only in this project, but in real life. No more single episodes this time. This is going to be a super-sized episode, so without any further ado, let's get cracking. Starting off with a movie that serves as a last stand for, well, an actress that acted. Named Kate Capshaw. It's The Love Letter.
The Love Letter.
Janet, watch the kids.
I got him. Okay, be careful.
The Love Letter was directed by Peter Chan, and it starred Kate Capshaw, as well as Tom Everett Scott, and a mustacheless Tom Selleck. A mustacheless Tom Selleck can't scare you. Mustacheless Tom Selleck. It tells the story of a lonely woman who lives on a town that's eerily reminiscent of Amity Island from Jaws. Oh, how I wish there was a shark in this movie. But regardless, she runs a bookstore, which, in another kind of twist, I'm reviewing a movie a little later on in this video where the main character owns a bookstore. Scary how those coincidences work. But she finds a love letter addressed to nobody, and it becomes the talk of the town. Like I said, this was Kate Capshaw's final movie before her retirement. She is probably best known for being Willie Scott in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. A movie that I am not a fan of, but apparently a lot of people really like, and some are crazy enough to say it's their favorite Indiana Jones movie in the same franchise that includes Raiders of the Lost Ark and The Last Crusade, but I digress. This movie was boring. It was so boring. This isn't bad by any means. It was competent, but I think competent is about as good as I can put it. This movie was just a slog, and it wasn't even that long. It was 90 minutes, and it felt longer than that. Every performance in here is good. Kate Capshaw is good. Tom Selleck is good. Seeing him without the stash is very weird, but again, I have addressed that. Tom Everett Scott is good. Ellen DeGeneres is not playing a hard-boiled Humphrey Bogart detective. That is a very good thing indeed. Ultimately, the thing that just bothered me about the movie was just how in this small town, how this letter just ruins everything. I was just sitting there like, how small is this town for this letter to dominate the entire conversation? It's just a thoroughly nothing movie. I'm struggling to even remember it while reviewing it. It is very forgettable. It is competent, but that's the best I can describe it. Let's move on now to yet another movie from the fine folks at HBO. But thankfully, this is much better than The Love Letter. It is A Lesson Before Dying.
I'd like to go down, Mr. Williams.
So do I.
A Lesson Before Dying was directed by Joseph Sargent, whose work includes directing such movies as MacArthur, starring Gregory Peck, and Jaws the Revenge. Yes, you can put a face to that awful movie. Thankfully, this movie is a lot better than Jaws the Revenge, that being A Lesson Before Dying. It is based on the book of the same name written by Ernest Gaines, and it tells the story of a teacher, played by Don Cheadle, who is enlisted by his aunt to basically lift the spirits and teach some level of dignity to a young black man who is about to go to the electric chair for a crime that he did not commit. This takes place in the 1930s era South, so you could pretty much put two and two together from there why this young man is in the situation that he is in. The track record of HBO throughout this project has been so-so. There have been some forgettable ones, but the last HBO movie I covered was The Jack Bull, which was awesome. This movie's not as good as The Jack Bull, but it is very enjoyable, and it comes on the back of an incredible performance from Don Cheadle. This might be some of the best that I have ever seen from him. He won a Primetime Emmy Award for this role, and rightfully so, because he absolutely crushed it. The through line throughout the movie is that he really doesn't know what he's supposed to teach this young man. He's basically put into a must-lose situation where he's asked by his aunt to teach this guy to basically go to his deathbed with some level of dignity, because in his trial, He was called a hog by his defense attorney, and it broke him mentally to the point where he basically believes it. And it's depressing to see. Like, the courtroom scene in this movie legitimately frustrated me. I was like, this is the defense attorney. I don't want to know what the prosecuting attorney was saying. Heavily implied that Cheadle's character was a man of God, but he had a falling out. He's wanting to get romantically involved with this woman, but it's very on the rocks. So he's got a lot going on. He's trying to be a teacher in the 1930s in the Jim Crow era South, which is probably just one of the hardest things you could ever hope to accomplish. So he's got a lot on his plate, and Cheadle carries this movie on his back. He's got to handle his aunt's demands while also maintaining his own dignity in the face of very ignorant white people. Not to mention a black preacher who is trying to convince him to get the young man who is the prisoner to repent his sins and get him right with God before he goes to the pearly gates, which, again, Cheadle's character has had a falling out, so there's complications there. This movie very much felt like a play, and I mean that as a compliment. It's very performance heavy. There's not really an action scene. Really, the most action we get in the movie is near the beginning as to why the young man was basically convicted of this crime that he just did not do. He was an innocent party in all of. That's the most we get. That's all the context you need, and then the rest of it is people talking in courtrooms and houses and jail cells. That's about it. But because Cheadle is so good, I'm going to give this a good rating. A very high good rating. Almost great. The rest of the movie is pretty good, but Cheadle carries it over the top. He really does give it his all here. But now let's move on to my favorite movie that I'm going to be covering this week, and a movie that took me way too long to finally get to. It's a little ditty called Notting Hill.
Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant in a place called Notting Hill.
Notting Hill was directed by Roger Michelle, probably butchered it, and I'm sorry. It was written by Michael Curtis, the man who would go on to direct movies such as About Time and be a prolific screenwriter for a lot of British rom-coms. And the movie starred Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant, among many others. It tells the story of a man played by Grant who owns a travel bookstore in the Notting Hill section of London. He is a very simple man. He owns this bookstore. His wife left him because, according to him, the man that she left him for looked like Harrison Ford. He has a roommate who is just a straight-up weirdo played by Rhys Ifans, aka the Lizard from the Amazing Spider-Man movies, and a very eclectic family, one of whom is played by Hugh Bonneville of Downton Abbey fame. He very much keeps to himself. But one day, someone stumbles into his bookshop, and that someone is only the biggest actress in the world, named Anna Scott, played by Julia Roberts. Basically, Julia Roberts turned up to like 11. And the two form a romance from there. I'm slowly becoming a big fan of Michael Curtis, and I'm not the biggest fan of Love Actually. As a matter of fact, I think I said in my Chris Mania review for that it was overrated, but I love About Time. It's one of my favorite romance movies. I can watch it any day of the week and not get bored by it. And that goes the same for Notting Hill. This movie was so much better than I was going into it, like, expecting to. I did not expect to like it as much as I did. It's one of those movies that when people say Notting Hill, you know exactly what they're talking about. It's one of those romance movies. But I wasn't sure if I was going to like it or not. Turns out I loved it. Julia Roberts is awesome in this movie. She basically plays herself, but a different name. But she's given a lot more depth than just the big-time movie star. Honestly, some of my favorite scenes are with her and Hugh Grant and his family. One of my absolute favorite scenes is when they're all sitting around the table together. They've had this dinner. They're having brownies for dessert. I like this family already. And to see who gets the last brownie, they basically say their problems and like who gets the most pity. Whoever gets the most pity gets the last brownie. And then Julia Roberts talks about how she's been on a diet since she was 19. So in her own words, She's been hungry for a decade. She had an abusive boyfriend, and she basically says that she just can't act, and she is on the slow path to becoming irrelevant. She ultimately loses the game, but I appreciated that depth. I love that scene so much. Hugh Grant in this movie is not some doe-eyed, like, oh, I'm in love. Like, he's actually got stuff going on. Like, he's not some idiot. Like, in order to get in touch with Anna Scott, he basically has to pose as a reporter for this magazine called Hound Horses and Hounds. And he gets in these situations that just make you laugh. And only Hugh Grant could pull it off because he is so charming. He gets to interview Anna Scott under the guise of Miss Flintstone, which popped me. But then he has to interview every single other co-star that is on this press tour. And it got a kick out of me. I'm going to give this an amazing grade. This movie is charming as hell, and I'm probably going to see it a few more times. But let's move on now. Let's take a bit of a dip in quality, but not too steep. Let's go into one of my favorite realms, sci-fi, the 13th floor.
The 13th floor. You can go there, even though it doesn't exist.
The 13th Floor was directed by Joseph Rusnak, I hope I said his name right, and the movie starred Craig Bierko, Vincent D'Onofrio, and Dennis Haysbert, among others. It tells the story of a man who is the head of this very big tech company. His boss is murdered in an alley in cold blood, and while picking up the pieces as to what happened here, he discovers a piece of technology that his boss was working on where it basically works like the machine in Inception, except you can't go into dreams, and instead you go into a simulation of the past. And in the case of his boss, it was 1930s Los Angeles. So this guy has to figure out who killed his boss while also staving off the advances of Detective McBain, played by Dennis Haysbert. There is an image from this movie where Craig Bierko walks out into this desert and you see this big old green mountain. I've seen this image a ton of times and I had no idea what it was for. It turns out it was for this movie. The more you know. But I walked into it completely blind, and it wasn't perfect, but I got a great deal of enjoyment out of it. I'm a big sci-fi geek, so that probably had a lot to do with it, but I got a kick out of about 85% of this movie. Craig Bierko is good in the movie, and he actually had quite a bit of a career that's still going on. He's been in movies like Cinderella Man and other things like that. He's been mostly a bit player, but he's the lead here, and he does a pretty good job. Vincent D'Onofrio is predictably great as this technician who he has long hair, which just is weird to me, but it works. I've always been a big fan of Dennis Haysbert, whether he's in 24 or some random insurance commercial.
Put them in good hands.
But Dennis Haysbert was really good here as a detective. And seeing the simulated LA and these little touches of it not being fully developed because there's no real colors added, and so it looks very brownish. It turns out that was a whole simulation thing. I love little touches like that. It wasn't like a Ready Player One situation where we go into the movie and the world is already built. You're basically seeing a world being built in progress, for lack of a better word. I like the spirit of that. Where the movie kind of falls apart for me is the final twist at the end. Basically, it kind of turns into a twist something out of Don't Worry, Darling, which is a very, very bad thing. I won't spoil it, but the twist almost killed the movie for me. But there's some cool concepts here. The acting is good. There's some good action scenes. I'm going to give this a good rating, but a high good rating. The ending is not great, but the rest of the movie is solid. But we opened this video with the last performance of an actress. Now it's time for the last performance of a great actor, one of the all-time greats, as a matter of fact. George C. Scott. It's Inherit the Wind. Inherit the Wind was directed by Daniel Petrie. It was made for Showtime, and it starred George C. Scott in his final film role before his passing, and Jack Lemmon, along with Tom Everett Scott. Two movies in this video with Tom Everett Scott in it. That dude was a busy boy in '99. but this is based on the play of the same name and is a television remake of a classic movie starring Spencer Tracy and Friedrich March. And yes, the horror fan in me totally got that in the original, both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from the 30s and the 40s were in that movie. That could not have been a coincidence. But the movie tells the story of a school teacher who is caught teaching evolution in a very, very, very Christian town. This is apparently like up there with like murder or something or the like because it causes the crime of the century. This movie is based loosely on the 1925 Scopes monkey trial in and around that time. And it based on the play, which the play kind of lampoons the McCarthy trials or McCarthyism of the 50s. The prosecution is represented by George C. Scott, and the defense is represented by Jack Lemmon, and let the battle of the acting heavyweights commence. George C. Scott is one of the all-time greats. He would win an Oscar for Patton and just be in a ton of movies. And Jack Lemmon, I mean, we all know who he is. He was basically one of Billy Wilder's go-to guys for a lot of years. He would win an Oscar for The Apartment, and he would star in one of my favorite comedies of all time, Grumpy Old Men, alongside Walter Matthau. This movie understands its assignment in that there are a lot of scenes in which George C. Scott and Jack Lemmon face off dialogue for dialogue, and it is glorious. It is just as amazing as you think it is. What I like about the movie is that neither side is really portrayed as, like, the villain, per se. There are definitely bad actors on the evolution side and the creation side. However, when it comes to the lawyers, being George C. Scott and Jack Lemmon, there's a respect for each other. It's heavily implied that they're both pretty good friends. However, they disagree on this one issue, and this one issue is the straw that breaks the camel's back. They're not doing personal attacks, they're very much pros, but they approach this very seriously.
Possible there is something holy to the celebrated agnostic? Oh, yes. The individual human mind.
I can see what they're doing, what he's doing. I can see it, I feel it. He's cooking.
It's just focused on the courtroom scenes. The movie's excellent. When it's got other stuff, I didn't care for it. There is a preacher in the movie played by Lane Smith, aka the coach of the Sharks from the Mighty Ducks, who is the preacher of the town and is a complete cartoon character. Like, he goes into several monologues of like, oh, God will damn you, and like all of that. It took me out of the movie completely. And I get it. They're trying to capture the style at the time, I understand that. But I think it could have toned it down just a bit. Same thing goes for the reporter, played by Brad Greenquist. He is very much on the side of the atheists and the evolutionists. He is very much your standard reporter who is just there to cover the story, but it's very obvious that he doesn't believe in any of this God stuff. And a lot of the things he says, he's very clearly like an egotistical dude. Like, he says something in the line of, I never thought I'd fall in love with something other than my own words. I'm like, yeah, that's very much a mask-off moment there, my dude. Little things like that to where it didn't kill the movie for me, but I was just watching that and going, you could be a little more subtle with that, I'm just saying. But because there are a lot of scenes involving George C. Scott and Jack Lemmon, and sometimes both, I'm going to give this movie a great rating. This is severely underrated. It is currently on Tubi. I recommend you give it a watch. But what did you all think of any of the movies I've talked about? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to read what you have to say. And stay tuned for next week, where I will be covering a documentary called Bona Vista Social Club, directed by Wim Wenders, as well as a movie called Instinct and a movie called Limbo, one of which is starring Anthony Hopkins. But that is for next Friday. My name is Ryan Cam. I'll see you in the next one.